The tornado sirens began their bone-chilling wail at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that would change everything. Sarah Martinez pressed her face against the break room window on the fourth floor of Springfield General Hospital, watching the sky turn an unnatural shade of green. Lightning flickered inside the massive wall cloud approaching from the southwest, and she could feel the building vibrate as thunder rolled across the Illinois prairie. "Jesus Christ," whispered Maria Rodriguez, the pediatric nurse who'd been heating up leftover pizza in the microwave. "That thing's huge." The emergency radio on the break room table crackled to life. "All units, we have multiple tornadoes confirmed. EF, 3 strength with winds exceeding 165 miles per hour. Direct path toward the medical district. Estimated time to impact, 18 minutes. Sarah's stomach dropped. 18 minutes. She grabbed the radio and turned up the volume as the dispatcher continued. "Springfield General, we have 23 ambulances en route from Chatham and Auburn. Multiple trauma cases from direct tornado strikes. ETA, 12 to 15 minutes. The break room door burst open, and Derek Morrison, the hospital administrator, rushed in wearing his expensive Navy suit that somehow never seemed to wrinkle despite the chaos that constantly surrounded him. His face was flushed, and sweat beaded on his receding hairline. "Everyone needs to evacuate immediately," Morrison shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "Corporate has issued a level 1 evacuation order. All non-essential personnel out of the building now." Sarah turned from the window, her brown eyes flashing. "Derek, we just heard the radio. We've got 23 ambulances coming with tornado victims. How are we non-essential?" Morrison adjusted his tie nervously. "The protocol is clear, Sarah. In severe weather events, we evacuate to ensure staff safety. Patient transfers go to Metro Downtown." "Metro Downtown?" Maria's voice rose in disbelief. "That's 45 minutes away on a good day. In this weather, people will die." "That's not our problem," Morrison snapped. "Our insurance doesn't cover staff injuries during level 1 events. The liability alone—" Another voice cut through the argument. Emergency dispatch again. "Springfield General, be advised. Interstate 55 is closed due to debris. Multiple vehicle accidents blocking major arteries. Metro Downtown reports they're at capacity and requesting diversion." Sarah looked back out the window. The wall cloud was closer now, maybe 8 miles out. She could see the faint gray tendril of a funnel beginning to form. Below in the parking lot, she spotted the first ambulance racing toward the emergency entrance, its lights cutting through the eerie yellow-green atmosphere. "Derek," Sarah said quietly, turning back to face the administrator. "Those ambulances are already here." Morrison's face went white as he peered out the window. "Shit. Okay, we process them quickly and get them transferred. 5 minutes max per patient." 5 minutes? Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. Some of these people probably need immediate surgery. Complex trauma doesn't happen on your timeline. "The protocol exists for a reason, Sarah. We cannot risk—" The building shook as another thunderclap rattled the windows. This time, the lights flickered. Sarah grabbed her trauma bag from her locker and slung it over her shoulder. "Maria, James, Tanya, whoever wants to stay, we're setting up triage in the parking lot." "What?" Morrison's voice went up an octave. "You absolutely cannot do that. I forbid it." "Forbid it?" Sarah was already heading for the door. "Derek, there are people bleeding to death in those ambulances right now while you're worried about insurance liability. I didn't become a nurse to abandon patients because of weather." James Chen, a solid ER nurse with 10 years of trauma experience, stood up from the table where he'd been quietly eating his lunch. "I'm with Sarah." Tanya Williams, a veteran OR nurse in her mid-40s who'd seen everything twice, nodded. "Count me in." Morrison's face flushed red. "If you walk out that door, you're all fired." "I'm not kidding. Your nursing careers will be over." Sarah paused at the break room door and looked back at him. For a moment, her resolve wavered. She thought about her mortgage, her student loans, her mother's medical bills. Then she heard the sirens getting closer and saw another ambulance turning into the hospital drive. "Fire me tomorrow, Derek. Today I save lives." She walked out, and 5 other nurses followed her. The elevator seemed to take forever. Sarah watched the numbers descend while listening to her radio. "Springfield General, we have a pediatric trauma, age 8, head injury with possible brain bleed. Patient needs immediate surgical consultation." "Copy that," Sarah responded, even though she wasn't officially dispatched. "We'll be ready." The elevator opened on the ground floor, and they could hear Morrison's voice echoing down the stairwell as he ran after them. "Security! I need security at the main entrance immediately. Sarah pushed through the lobby doors into the parking lot, and the wind nearly knocked her over. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in the last 10 minutes, and debris was already swirling in small funnels across the asphalt. The first ambulance was backing up to what used to be the emergency entrance, but she could see that the automatic doors weren't opening. Power's already going out, James shouted over the wind. Sarah keyed her radio again. This is Charge Nurse Martinez. Hospital main entrance is non-functional. We're setting up emergency triage in the west parking lot. All incoming units follow the blue Honda to the alternate location. She ran toward her car, waving for the ambulances to follow. The EMTs looked confused, but started moving in her direction. By the time she reached the far side of the parking lot, the side that would be sheltered by the hospital building when the wind shifted, the first ambulance crew was jumping out. "What's the situation?" called EMT Captain Rodriguez, a man Sarah had worked with dozens of times over the years. 8-year-old with head trauma, Sarah called back, pulling supplies from her bag. "We need to set up right here. The hospital's evacuating, but we've got critical patients who won't survive transport to Metro downtown." Rodriguez looked at the sky, then back at Sarah. "You sure about this, Sarah? That tornado's maybe 10 minutes out?" Sarah was already opening the ambulance doors. Inside, a small boy lay unconscious, his head wrapped in bloody bandages. His mother sat beside him, tears streaming down her face. "Ma'am, what's your son's name?" Sarah asked gently, climbing into the ambulance. "Tyler," the woman whispered. "Tyler Johnson. We were in our trailer when it hit. The whole thing just disappeared. Please don't let him die." Sarah checked Tyler's pupils. Unequal and sluggish. Classic sign of increased intracranial pressure. This child needed a neurosurgeon 15 minutes ago. "Mrs. Johnson, we're going to take very good care of Tyler. I need you to stay calm for him, okay?" Sarah looked back at Rodriguez. "We can't move him. Any transport right now will kill him. We treat him here." "Here? In a parking lot? In a tornado?" "Yes." More ambulances were arriving. Sarah counted 6 so far, with more lights visible in the distance. She turned to her team of nurses, who were already pulling supplies from their bags and setting up a makeshift triage area using their cars as windbreaks. "Okay, people," Sarah shouted over the increasing wind. "We've got multiple trauma cases, limited supplies, and maybe 8 minutes before this gets really interesting. Maria, you take pediatric and obstetric cases. James, you're on adult trauma. Tanya, you coordinate supplies and medications." That's when the Springfield police arrived. Captain Rick Bradley stepped out of his patrol car, looking every inch the by-the-book cop who'd spent 25 years following orders without question. His uniform was pressed, his badge gleamed, and his expression clearly indicated he wasn't interested in hearing explanations. "Ma'am," he called to Sarah as she knelt beside Tyler Johnson, checking the boy's 4-line. "You need to clear this area immediately. We have a mandatory evacuation order for this entire district." Sarah looked up from Tyler, whose breathing had become more labored in the last 2 minutes. "Captain, this child has a traumatic brain injury. If we move him now, he'll die." "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but we have protocols." "Your protocols don't include saving lives?" Sarah's voice carried an edge that surprised even her. She'd always been respectful to authority figures, but watching Tyler's condition deteriorate was stripping away her patience with bureaucracy. Captain Bradley's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, you are interfering with emergency operations. I'm ordering you to evacuate this location immediately, or I will place you under arrest." The wind gusted hard enough to rock the ambulances. In the distance, they could hear the low rumble that meant the tornado was getting closer. Sarah looked at Tyler's mother, who was clutching her son's hand and whispering prayers. "Captain Bradley," Sarah said, standing up slowly. Her scrubs were already stained with blood from 3 different patients. "Look around you. We have 8 ambulances here with critically injured people. The hospital has no power and has evacuated. Metro downtown is 45 minutes away through blocked roads. Where exactly do you suggest we take them?" "That's not my decision to make. I have orders to clear this area, and I have a duty to preserve life." Sarah turned back to Tyler and began adjusting his oxygen flow. "So unless you're planning to arrest a nurse for treating patients, I suggest you help us by directing traffic and keeping this area clear." Bradley's hand moved to his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I need backup at Springfield General. We have civilians refusing to comply with evacuation orders." Before dispatch could respond, another voice crackled through the radio. "All units be advised. Tornado has touched down in Chatham. Multiple structures destroyed. We have confirmed casualties and are requesting all available medical personnel to assist. Sarah looked up at Captain Bradley. Captain, your own dispatch is asking for medical personnel. We are medical personnel. We are exactly where we need to be. A new voice joined the argument. Derek Morrison had arrived with 2 hospital security guards, both of whom looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Officer, I want these people arrested immediately, Morrison announced, his voice shaking with anger. They are trespassing on hospital property and practicing medicine without authorization. Without authorization? Maria Rodriguez looked up from the pregnant woman she was examining in the back of an ambulance. Derek, I've been a licensed nurse here for 6 years. Not anymore, Morrison snapped. You were all terminated the moment you left the building against direct orders. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. Derek, you can't fire us for treating patients. I can fire you for endangering hospital liability and violating evacuation protocols. These security officers will now confiscate any hospital property in your possession and escort you from the premises. One of the security guards, a young man named Pete, who'd always been friendly during Sarah's late-night coffee runs, looked uncomfortable. Mr. Morrison, ma'am, I'm not sure we should be taking medical supplies away from. You'll do your job, Pete, or you'll join them in the unemployment line. Sarah watched in disbelief as Pete reluctantly approached her trauma bag. Pete, that bag contains the medication keeping that little boy alive. Pete stopped, his hand hovering over the bag. Behind him, Morrison's face was getting redder by the minute. Take the bag, Pete. That's a direct order. The tornado sirens were getting louder. Sarah could see the funnel cloud clearly now, maybe 3 miles out and heading directly toward them. The wind was strong enough that she had to brace herself against the ambulance to stay upright. This is insane, James Chen muttered, but he didn't stop working on the elderly man whose chest had been crushed by flying debris. We're arguing about protocol while people are dying? Captain Bradley was getting more backup than he'd requested. 2 more patrol cars arrived, along with a fire truck. But instead of supporting the evacuation order, Fire Captain Mike Santos jumped out of his truck and ran directly to Sarah. Sarah! Thank God you're still here. We just got word that Metro Downtown is completely overwhelmed. They're not taking any more trauma cases for at least 2 hours. Is there anything you need? Mike, we need power, and we need protection from this wind, Sarah called back. And apparently we need protection from our own administration? Santos looked at Morrison with barely concealed disgust. You're trying to shut down the only functioning medical facility in the county? This is not a medical facility, Morrison shouted. This is a parking lot. These people are practicing medicine without proper oversight, without adequate facilities, without... His words were cut off by the sound of screeching brakes as another ambulance pulled up. The EMT driver jumped out and ran toward Sarah. We've got a multi-vehicle accident on Route 36, he called. Family of 5, including twin infants. The mother's in labor and one of the babies is in distress. Where do you want them? Sarah looked at Morrison, then at Captain Bradley, then at the tornado that was now close enough that they could hear the freight train roar over the wind. Bring them here, she said. We'll make room. Morrison stepped in front of the EMT. You will not bring those patients here. This operation is being shut down immediately. The EMT, a veteran named Carlos, who'd seen too much to be impressed by guys in suits, looked Morrison up and down. Sir, with all due respect, that woman in labor isn't going to wait for your paperwork to be in order. Where's your emergency room? Evacuated. Your backup facility? There isn't one. Carlos turned back to Sarah. Then I guess you're it. Carlos, you can't leave patients with unauthorized personnel. Captain Bradley interjected. Watch me. Carlos was already heading back to his ambulance. I've got a professional obligation to deliver patients to competent medical care. I see competent medical care. I don't see a functioning hospital. As Carlos and his partner wheeled the stretcher towards Sarah's triage area, Morrison made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Pete, I want you to physically prevent any more patients from being brought to this area. Use whatever force is necessary. Pete looked at Morrison like he'd lost his mind. Sir, you want me to block ambulances? I want you to protect this hospital from liability. Sarah was helping transfer the laboring mother from the stretcher to the back of a pickup truck that someone had volunteered as a makeshift delivery room when she heard Morrison's order. She stood up slowly and walked over to where the administrator was standing. Derek, she said quietly, if you prevent that ambulance from bringing those babies here, and they die because of it, I will personally make sure that every news station in the state knows exactly who made that decision. Morrison's face went pale, but he didn't back down. "You're already done, Sarah. All of you. This ends now." That's when they heard the roar getting louder. The sound started as a distant freight train and built to the roar of a jet engine taking off. Sarah looked up from the laboring mother to see the tornado, fully formed and massive, bearing down on Springfield General Hospital's north wing. "Everyone down?" Fire Captain Santos shouted. "It's going to hit the building!" The next 30 seconds felt like an eternity. The wind reached a crescendo that made conversation impossible. Debris began raining down around them, chunks of roofing, pieces of cars, things Sarah couldn't even identify. She threw herself over Tyler Johnson's stretcher, using her body to shield the unconscious 8-year-old from the flying wreckage. The tornado struck the hospital's north wing with a sound like the world ending. Sarah felt the ground shake beneath her as 4 stories of brick and steel were reduced to rubble in less than 20 seconds. Car alarms were going off all around them, but she could barely hear them over the continued roar of wind. When the sound finally began to fade, Sarah cautiously raised her head. The north wing of Springfield General Hospital was gone. Just gone. Where there had been patient rooms and offices and the main pharmacy 15 minutes earlier, there was now a pile of twisted metal and broken concrete. "Jesus Christ," whispered James Chen. "If we'd been inside." Sarah's hands were shaking as she checked Tyler's vital signs. Amazingly, his condition had actually stabilized during the storm. The boy's eyes were tracking movement now, and his breathing was stronger. "The power's completely out," Maria called from the pregnant woman's improvised delivery room. "But I think being outside actually protected us. The building took the hit instead of us." Derek Morrison was standing in the middle of the parking lot, staring at what remained of his hospital. His expensive suit was torn and dirty. His carefully styled hair was disheveled, and for the first time since Sarah had known him, he looked completely lost. "The backup generators," he mumbled. They were in the north wing basement. Captain Bradley was coordinating with other emergency responders who'd arrived after the tornado passed. Sarah could hear him on his radio. "Dispatch, Springfield General Hospital has sustained major structural damage. The facility is non-operational. We need all available medical personnel at—" "Where exactly are we setting up?" Sarah stood up and walked over to him. "Captain, we're right here. We never stopped operating." Bradley looked around the parking lot. In the hour since they'd started, the makeshift triage area had grown into something that actually resembled a functional medical facility. Cars were arranged in a rough rectangle to provide wind protection, with different areas designated for different types of patients. Someone had brought floodlights powered by portable generators. A local restaurant owner had shown up with coffee and sandwiches for the medical staff. "How many patients have you treated?" Bradley asked. Sarah consulted the notebook where she'd been tracking cases. 43 so far. We've stabilized 12 critical cases that wouldn't have survived transport. No fatalities." "No fatalities?" "None. Tyler Johnson there needs neurosurgical follow-up, but his intracranial pressure has stabilized. The pregnant woman delivered healthy twins about 20 minutes ago. The elderly gentleman with chest trauma is stable and ready for transport when the road's clear." Captain Bradley looked back at the destroyed hospital, then at Morrison, who was still standing in shock. "So, let me get this straight. The official hospital evacuation plan left us with no medical facility and no emergency backup. But your unauthorized parking lot operation has treated 43 patients with 0 deaths?" "That's correct." Bradley keyed his radio. "Dispatch, be advised that we have a functional medical triage facility operating in the west parking lot of Springfield General. Recommend directing all incoming medical emergencies to this location until further notice." Morrison snapped out of his shock. "You cannot do that! This is not an authorized medical facility." "Sir," Bradley replied, "your authorized medical facility is currently a pile of rubble. I'm directing emergency resources to where they can actually help people." The next hour brought a steady stream of tornado victims. Sarah's team treated everything from minor cuts and bruises to complex trauma cases. They performed an emergency appendectomy on a teenage girl, using the back of an ambulance as an operating room. Maria successfully resuscitated an elderly man who went into cardiac arrest. James Chen sutured dozens of lacerations and set multiple broken bones. Through it all, Morrison continued his protests. He called the state medical board, the hospital's insurance company, and the corporate headquarters of Springfield General's parent company. Each call seemed to make him more agitated. "This is a lawsuit waiting to happen," he kept repeating to anyone who would listen. "When someone dies because of this unauthorized treatment, the liability will destroy us." But nobody was dying. Despite the primitive conditions, despite the lack of proper facilities, despite the continued chaos of the post-tornado emergency response, Sarah's team was achieving something remarkable. They were saving everyone. Dr. Patricia Thornfield, the director of the State Medical Board, arrived at sunset. Sarah was exhausted, having been on her feet for 6 straight hours treating one critical case after another, when she noticed the expensive sedan pulling into the parking lot. Dr. Thornfield was a small, severe-looking woman in her 60s who had built her career on regulatory compliance and protocol enforcement. She approached Sarah with a clipboard and a disapproving frown. "Nurse Martinez, I understand you've been operating an unauthorized medical facility in violation of state regulations." Sarah looked up from the teenage boy whose broken arm she was immobilizing. "Dr. Thornfield, I've been treating tornado victims because there was no other option. There's always another option. You could have followed proper evacuation procedures and transferred patients to authorized facilities." "What authorized facilities?" "Metro downtown was overwhelmed, the roads were impassable, and our hospital was destroyed." Dr. Thornfield made notes on her clipboard. "That's not relevant to the question of whether you followed proper protocols." Maria Rodriguez, who'd been listening to the conversation while monitoring the vital signs of a patient with internal injuries, couldn't stay quiet. "Dr. www.gov. Thornfield, we've saved dozens of lives today. Isn't that what matters?" "What matters, Nurse Rodriguez, is that medical care is provided within the proper regulatory framework. Patient safety requires oversight and accountability." "Patient safety?" Sarah's voice carried an edge of disbelief. "We've had 0 fatalities, 0 complications, perfect patient outcomes under impossible conditions. Outcomes achieved through unauthorized procedures that created unnecessary liability for the hospital and potential danger for patients." Sarah stared at Dr. Thornfield for a long moment. "So you're saying it would have been better to let these people die following proper procedures than to save them using improper ones?" "I'm saying that the ends don't justify the means in medical practice. We have protocols for a reason." That's when Tommy Sullivan arrived. Tommy Sullivan owned Sullivan's Auto Repair, a small garage 3 blocks from the hospital that specialized in keeping old cars running for people who couldn't afford new ones. He was 45 years old, built like a linebacker, and had oil permanently embedded under his fingernails. His 8-year-old nephew Tyler Johnson was sitting up in the back of an ambulance, conscious and talking for the first time since the tornado hit. "Sarah," Tommy said, walking up to the nurse who'd saved his nephew's life. His voice was thick with emotion. "The EMTs told me what you did, if you hadn't been here." "Tyler's going to be fine," Sarah replied, exhaustion evident in her voice. "He needs follow-up care, but the worst is over." Tommy looked around the parking lot medical facility, taking in the organized chaos of the ongoing emergency response. "This is incredible. You built a hospital in a parking lot. We did what we had to do, and now they're trying to shut you down for it?" Sarah glanced over at Dr. Thornfield, who was conducting interviews with other members of the medical board and making extensive notes. "It looks that way." The next morning brought a formal investigation notice delivered by certified mail to Sarah's apartment. The State Medical Board was launching a formal inquiry into unauthorized medical practice, patient endangerment, and violation of emergency protocols. Sarah's nursing license was suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. The suspension meant she couldn't work. It meant she couldn't make her mortgage payment or cover her student loans. Most importantly, it meant she couldn't do the job she'd trained for and loved for the past 12 years. Derek Morrison held a press conference at the temporary hospital command center that had been set up in a local school gymnasium. Flanked by lawyers and public relations specialists, he presented the hospital's official version of events. "While we appreciate the dedication of our nursing staff, the unauthorized medical facility created dangerous conditions that put patients at risk," Morrison read from a prepared statement. "Proper emergency protocols exist for a reason, and deviating from these protocols, regardless of intention, creates liability issues that could jeopardize the hospital's ability to provide care to the community." A reporter from the Springfield Herald raised her hand. "Mr. Morrison, can you comment on reports that the unauthorized facility achieved 0 fatalities while treating over 100 tornado victims? Patient outcomes achieved through unauthorized means cannot be considered reliable indicators of proper medical care. The potential for catastrophic failure in such situations is enormous." "But there were no failures. Are you saying the nurses should have let people die rather than treat them outside proper channels?" Morrison's PR advisor whispered something in his ear. "The hospital corporation stands behind proper protocols and regulatory compliance. We cannot comment on hypothetical scenarios." The story made the local news. but not in the way Sarah had hoped. The headline read, "Hospital Investigates Rogue Nurses After Tornado Response." The article focused on the liability issues and regulatory violations rather than the lives saved. Sarah's phone started ringing early the next morning. The first call was from the hospital's legal department. "Miss Martinez, this is Jennifer Walsh from Crenshaw, Palmer, Associates. We represent Springfield General Hospital. I need to inform you that the hospital will be pursuing legal action to recover damages related to the unauthorized use of hospital equipment and medications during the tornado response." Sarah sat down heavily on her couch. Legal action? For using supplies to save lives? The hospital incurred significant liability exposure due to your actions. Additionally, several pieces of equipment were damaged or lost during the unauthorized operation. The total damages are estimated at approximately 150. I don't have 150. We understand. We're prepared to offer a settlement agreement in which you would accept full responsibility for the unauthorized operation and agree not to discuss the events with media or other parties. In exchange, we would reduce the damages to 25 and allow payment over 5 years. Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. And if I don't accept, then we proceed with the full lawsuit and seek to recover all damages, plus legal fees and punitive damages for willful violation of hospital policy. The second call came an hour later from Dr. Tennant. "Thornfield's office. Nurse Martinez, this is Dr. Thornfield's assistant. The medical board has scheduled your disciplinary hearing for next Friday at 9 a.m. You have the right to legal representation, but I should inform you that the board's preliminary investigation has identified serious violations that typically result in permanent license revocation." Sarah stared out her living room window at the neighborhood she'd grown up in. 3 houses down, she could see Mrs. Patterson watering her garden. Mrs. Patterson watering her garden. Patterson was one of the patients she'd treated in the parking lot, a diabetic who'd been without her medication for 6 hours after the tornado destroyed her house. Sarah had stabilized her blood sugar and probably saved her life. The third call was the worst. "Sarah, this is Maria." Her fellow nurse's voice was shaky. "I just got served with papers. They're suing me too, and James, and Tanya, all of us." "How much?" "Same as you, 150 each. Plus they've suspended all our licenses pending the investigation." Sarah closed her eyes. "Maria, I'm so sorry. This is my fault. I should never have asked you to—" "Don't you dare apologize for saving lives." "But Sarah, I can't afford a lawyer. I can barely afford rent." That afternoon, Sarah drove to the hospital to clean out her locker. The building had been partially rebuilt with temporary structures, and normal operations had resumed in the undamaged south wing. As she walked through the familiar hallways, she noticed that her ID badge had already been deactivated. She had to be escorted by security. Pete, the security guard who'd been caught between his conscience and Morrison's orders during the tornado response, looked uncomfortable as he watched her pack her belongings. "Sarah, I'm really sorry about all this," he said quietly. "What you did out there, my daughter was in one of those ambulances. The doctors said if you hadn't stabilized her breathing, she wouldn't have made it to Metro downtown." Sarah looked up from her locker. "Your daughter? Emma. She's 7. She was visiting her grandmother when the tornado hit. Piece of roofing punctured her lung." Pete's voice broke slightly. "You saved her life, and now they're destroying yours for it." "Pete, I did what any nurse would do." "No, you didn't. Most nurses would have followed orders and evacuated. You chose to stay and save lives instead." As Sarah walked out of the hospital for what she assumed would be the last time, she noticed a small crowd gathering in the parking lot. About 24 people were holding signs. "Sarah Martinez is a hero. Nurses save lives. Fire Morrison, not nurses." One of the protesters was Mrs. Patterson, the diabetic woman from her neighborhood. "Sarah," Mrs. Patterson called out, "we heard what they're doing to you. It's not right." Sarah walked over to the group. She recognized most of the faces patients she'd treated during the tornado response. "Mrs. Patterson, you don't need to do this." "Yes, we do. You saved my life, and now they want to punish you for it? That's not right. That's not American." A news van pulled up, and a reporter jumped out. Sarah recognized Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7. "Ms. Martinez, can you comment on the hospital's decision to pursue legal action against you and the other nurses?" Sarah looked at the camera, then at the protesters, then back at the hospital where she'd worked for 12 years. "No comment," she said quietly, but someone else was ready to talk. The disciplinary hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in the sterile conference room of the State Medical Board. Sarah arrived 30 minutes early, clutching a folder containing documentation she'd compiled of every patient they'd treated during the tornado response. She couldn't afford a lawyer, so she'd decided to represent herself. The board consisted of 5 members: Dr. Patricia Thornfield as chair, 2 other physicians, a hospital administrator, and 1 registered nurse. Sarah recognized the nurse, Helen Crawford, as someone who'd built her career in administration rather than patient care. Derek Morrison was there with 3 lawyers from the hospital's legal team. He'd clearly prepared extensively, with binders full of documentation and several expert witnesses lined up to testify about proper emergency protocols. The hearing will come to order. Dr. Reachesley/1 Thornfield announced. We're here to examine the actions of Nurse Sarah Martinez during the tornado emergency of March 15th. Mr. Morrison, please present the hospital's case. Morrison stood up, looking confident in his expensive suit. Dr. Thornfield, members of the board, Springfield General Hospital has served this community for over 60 years with an exemplary safety record. That record was jeopardized when Nurse Martinez chose to disregard direct evacuation orders and establish an unauthorized medical facility in our parking lot. He presented a timeline of events that painted Sarah as a reckless maverick who'd put patients at risk through her unauthorized actions. According to Morrison's version, the hospital had followed proper protocols by evacuating during the tornado warning, and Sarah's decision to remain behind had created dangerous liability for both patients and staff. The hospital's insurance provider has confirmed that any incidents resulting from unauthorized treatment would not be covered under our malpractice policy, Morrison continued. Nurse Martinez's actions potentially exposed patients to substandard care and the hospital to millions of dollars in liability. Dr. Thornfield took notes throughout Morrison's presentation. Mr. Morrison, can you confirm the hospital's capacity to treat patients after the tornado struck? The north wing sustained damage, but our emergency protocols called for patient transfer to Metro downtown. Proper coordination with regional facilities would have ensured appropriate care for all tornado victims. Sarah listened to Morrison's testimony with growing disbelief. He was describing a version of events that bore no resemblance to what had actually happened. When it was her turn to present, Sarah stood up with her folder of patient documentation. Dr. Thornfield, members of the board, I've been a registered nurse for 12 years. I took an oath to preserve life and relieve suffering. On March 15th, I was faced with a choice: follow evacuation orders and abandon critical patients, or stay and provide life-saving care under difficult conditions. She opened her folder and began reading patient summaries. Tyler Johnson, 8-year-old with traumatic brain injury, stabilized and fully recovered. Maria Santos, pregnant woman who delivered healthy twins. Robert Chen, elderly man with chest trauma, successfully treated and transferred. In 8 hours, we treated 127 patients, 0 fatalities, 0 major complications, perfect patient outcomes under impossible conditions. Board member Dr. Plost, Richard Hayes, a cardiologist, raised his hand. Nurse Martinez, are you saying that you achieved better outcomes than would have been possible at a properly equipped hospital facility? I'm saying that we achieved the best possible outcomes under the circumstances. There were no properly equipped hospital facilities available. Springfield General was evacuated and then destroyed. Metro downtown was overwhelmed and unreachable. Dr. Thornfield frowned. Nurse Martinez, patient outcomes don't justify unauthorized medical practice. You were operating outside your scope of practice, without proper oversight, using equipment and medications that weren't properly accounted for. I was operating within my training and experience to save lives that would have been lost otherwise. You don't know that those lives would have been lost. Sarah stared at Dr. Thornfield. I know that Tyler Johnson was showing signs of herniation from increased intracranial pressure. Any transport at that point would have killed him. I know that Maria Santos was in active labor with twins in distress. I know that Robert Chen had a tension pneumothorax that required immediate decompression. The nurse on the board, Helen Crawford, spoke up. Nurse Martinez, those are complex medical conditions that typically require physician oversight. Are you claiming that you're qualified to make those diagnostic and treatment decisions independently? I'm claiming that I made the decisions necessary to keep people alive until more definitive care could be arranged. Morrison's lawyer stood up. Dr. Thornfield, we have expert testimony that the conditions described by Nurse Martinez were not properly assessed due to the lack of appropriate diagnostic equipment. Her assumption that patients were critical may have been incorrect. Sarah felt her temper rising. Are you seriously arguing that I imagined medical emergencies? We're arguing that without proper oversight and equipment, you couldn't have accurately assessed the severity of patient conditions. That's when the door opened and Captain Rodriguez walked in. EMT Captain Rodriguez had worked with Sarah dozens of times over the years. He was a 20-year veteran of emergency medical services who'd seen every kind of crisis and knew competent medical care when he saw it. "Excuse me," he said to Dr. Thornfield. "I was told this was a public hearing," Morrison's lawyer objected. "This witness isn't on our list." "I'm not a witness," Rodriguez replied. "I'm a concerned citizen who wants to address the board about a nurse who saved dozens of lives." Dr. Thornfield looked annoyed but nodded. "You may speak, but please be brief." Rodriguez walked to the front of the room. "Dr. Thornfield, I've been an EMT for 20 years. I've transported patients to every hospital in this region. On March 15th, I transported 8 critical patients to Sarah Martinez's triage facility. Every single one of them received expert, life-saving care." He pulled out a folder of his own. "I have documentation of every patient we brought to her location. I have follow-up reports on their conditions. I have testimony from other EMTs, firefighters, and police officers who witnessed her work." Morrison started to object, but Rodriguez continued. "Tyler Johnson was actively herniating when we arrived. Sarah's treatment saved his life. Maria Santos was in precipitous labor with a breech presentation. Sarah successfully delivered both babies and prevented maternal hemorrhage. Robert Chen was in respiratory distress from a collapsed lung. Sarah's needle decompression kept him alive until we could transport him for surgery." Dr. Thornfield looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Rodriguez, while we appreciate your input, patient outcomes aren't the only factor in determining appropriate medical practice. What other factors matter when people are dying?" The room fell silent. Sarah looked around at the board members and realized that they genuinely didn't understand the question. Helen Crawford, the nurse board member, finally spoke. "Mr. Rodriguez, proper protocols exist to ensure patient safety. When those protocols aren't followed, even good outcomes don't justify the violation." Rodriguez stared at her. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I don't think you understand what was happening out there. The hospital was gone. The roads were blocked. We had critically injured people who were going to die without immediate care. Sarah Martinez provided that care. She saved every single person we brought to her." Morrison's lawyer stood up again. "Mr. Rodriguez, are you qualified to determine the appropriateness of nursing interventions?" "I'm qualified to recognize competent emergency medical care, and I'm qualified to recognize when bureaucrats are punishing someone for doing the right thing." Dr. Thornfield gavelled for order. "Mr. Rodriguez, please limit your comments to factual observations." "Here's a factual observation. Sarah Martinez is the best trauma nurse I've ever worked with. She saved more lives in one afternoon than some doctors save in their entire careers. And you're destroying her for it." Rodriguez left his folder on the table and walked out. The hearing continued for another 2 hours, with Morrison presenting more expert testimony about protocols and liability. Sarah answered questions about her training, her decision-making process, and her assessment of patient conditions. Finally, Dr. Thornfield called for a recess while the board deliberated. Sarah sat alone in the hallway, exhausted and defeated. She'd done her best to present her case, but it was clear that the board was more concerned with regulatory compliance than patient outcomes. That's when her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Check your email. You need to see this. TR." Sarah opened her email and found a message from someone identified as Torch Reporter, with the subject line, "Springfield General Internal Documents." The email contained leaked hospital documents that changed everything. The leaked documents were damning. Internal emails between Derek Morrison and the hospital's corporate headquarters revealed that the evacuation order had been issued not for staff safety, but to limit the hospital's liability exposure. Even more shocking, the emails showed that Morrison had been aware the tornado would likely hit the hospital's north wing based on National Weather Service projections, but had chosen not to reinforce emergency protocols or prepare for mass casualties. One email, sent just 2 hours before the tornado hit, was particularly revealing. "Legal advises complete evacuation to avoid liability if tornado causes patient deaths on our property. Better to let Metro Downtown handle casualties and potential lawsuits." Sarah stared at the documents on her phone screen. Morrison hadn't been following safety protocols, he'd been following legal advice, designed to protect corporate assets rather than patients. When the hearing resumed, Sarah requested permission to present new evidence. Dr. Thornfield looked annoyed. "Nurse Martinez, the evidence period has closed." "Dr. Thornfield, I have documentation that fundamentally changes the context of the hospital's evacuation decision. Morrison's lawyer immediately objected. These appear to be privileged internal communications that were obtained illegally. I don't know how they were obtained, Sarah replied truthfully. But they show that the hospital's evacuation order was motivated by liability concerns rather than safety concerns. Dr. Thornfield reluctantly allowed Sarah to present the documents. As she read the emails aloud, the board members' expressions began to change. The nurse board member, Helen Crawford, looked particularly disturbed. Morrison turned red as his own words were read back to him. Those emails are taken out of context. The hospital's primary concern was always staff and patient safety. Sarah looked directly at him. Derek, your email from 2:15 p.m. specifically states, patient deaths during transport are Metro Downtown's liability, not ours. How is that about safety? That's not what that means. What does it mean? Morrison's lawyer placed a hand on his client's arm, clearly advising him not to answer. Dr. Hayes, the cardiologist on the board, leaned forward. Mr. Plant, Morrison, these documents suggest that the hospital knew the tornado would likely cause mass casualties but chose not to prepare emergency protocols. Is that accurate? The hospital followed all required emergency preparedness guidelines, but not optional ones that might have saved lives? Morrison was visibly sweating now. The hospital cannot be expected to prepare for every possible scenario. Sarah stood up. Dr. Hayes, the hospital had advance warning of the tornado's path. They had time to prepare for mass casualties. Instead, they chose to evacuate and send patients to an overwhelmed facility 45 minutes away during a natural disaster. Another board member, Dr. Susan Miller, spoke up. Nurse Martinez, are you saying that the hospital essentially abandoned its emergency medical responsibilities to the community? I'm saying that when the hospital chose to abandon those responsibilities, someone had to fulfill them. That's what we did. The room fell quiet as the implications sank in. Morrison's carefully constructed narrative about reckless nurses violating protocols was crumbling as the real story emerged. Corporate executives prioritizing legal liability over human life. Dr. Thornfield called for another recess, but as the board members filed out, Sarah could hear them arguing in the hallway. Morrison's lawyer approached Sarah during the break. Ms. Martinez, my client is prepared to offer a revised settlement. All legal action against you and the other nurses would be dropped in exchange for your agreement not to discuss these internal documents publicly. Sarah looked at the lawyer. And my nursing license? The hospital would support a recommendation for professional censure rather than license revocation. Professional censure for saving lives? For violating protocols? Yes. Sarah shook her head. No deal. When the hearing resumed, Dr. Thornfield announced that the board had voted to postpone their decision pending a more thorough investigation of the hospital's emergency preparedness policies. However, she continued, in light of the documentation presented, the board is prepared to lift the suspension of Nurse Martinez's license pending the final resolution of this case. It was a small victory, but Sarah felt like she'd been holding her breath for weeks and could finally exhale. Morrison was furious. As the hearing ended, he confronted Sarah in the hallway. This isn't over, he said quietly. You think you're some kind of hero, but all you've done is create a public relations nightmare that's going to cost the hospital millions of dollars. Derek, the only nightmare here is that you were more worried about money than human lives. You have no idea how the real world works. Hospitals are businesses. We can't save anyone if we're bankrupt from lawsuits. And you can't save anyone if you evacuate every time there's a crisis. Morrison walked away, but Sarah could hear him on his phone, presumably talking to his corporate superiors. Outside the medical board building, Sarah found a crowd of supporters waiting for her. Word of the hearing had spread, and patients she'd treated during the tornado response had organized to show their support. Tommy Sullivan was there with his nephew Tyler, who was completely recovered from his head injury. Sarah! Tyler ran up to her with the enthusiasm that only an 8-year-old could muster. Uncle Tommy says you're a superhero who saved my life. Sarah knelt down to Tyler's level. I'm not a superhero, Tyler. I'm just a nurse who was in the right place at the right time. That's what superheroes always say, Tyler replied seriously. Tommy walked over and shook Sarah's hand. How did it go in there? Better than I expected. They lifted my license suspension. What about the lawsuit? Sarah's expression darkened. That's still pending. Tommy nodded thoughtfully. Sarah, I've been thinking about something. You saved my nephew's life, and from what I hear, you saved a lot of other people too. But now you're facing financial ruin because of it. It's not your problem, Tommy. Actually, I think it is. See, I've been talking to some of the other guys who own shops around here. We all know people you helped that day. And we've been thinking that maybe it's time we return the favor. I don't understand. Tommy smiled. You took care of us when we needed it most. Now, we're going to take care of you. Tommy, I appreciate the thought, but Sarah, when's the last time you had your car serviced? The question caught her off guard. I don't know. It's been months. I can't afford. Exactly. And I bet the same is true for Maria and James and all the other nurses who stayed with you that day. Sarah began to understand what Tommy was suggesting. Tommy, you don't have to. Yes, we do, and we want to. As they talked, more people gathered around them. Sarah recognized faces from the tornado response. Patients she'd treated, family members she'd comforted, community members who'd volunteered to help during the crisis. Mrs. Patterson, the diabetic neighbor, stepped forward. Sarah, we heard about the lawsuit. We're starting a legal defense fund. Mrs. Patterson, that's very kind, but no buts. You saved lives. The least we can do is help you keep yours together. A local news reporter who'd been covering the hearing approached with a camera crew. Ms. Martinez, can you comment on the community support you're receiving? Sarah looked around at the crowd of people who'd gathered to support her. Many of them were struggling financially themselves, but they were offering what they could to help. I'm overwhelmed by the generosity of this community, Sarah said. These are the people I was trying to serve during the tornado response. The fact that they're willing to support me now, it means everything. What's next for you? I'm going back to work. I'm going to keep being a nurse and keep taking care of people. That's what I do. As the news crew packed up their equipment, Tommy pulled Sarah aside. Sarah, I meant what I said about taking care of your car. And not just yours, all the nurses who stood with you that day. We're going to make sure you're all taken care of. Tommy, you don't understand how much that would cost. Leave that to me. I've got an idea. Tommy Sullivan was about to prove that sometimes the best way to fight institutional power is with community action. Tommy Sullivan's auto shop had never seen so much activity. For the past 3 days, he'd been working 18-hour shifts alongside 5 other mechanics from shops around Springfield, preparing for what he was calling Operation Appreciation Day. The idea had started simple: fix Sarah Martinez's car as a thank you for saving his nephew's life. But as word spread through the community, it had grown into something much bigger. Tommy, we've got 12 shops confirmed, called out Mike Patterson from Patterson's Tire Service. Plus, the parts suppliers are donating everything at cost. Tommy wiped his hands on a shop rag and looked at the list they'd compiled. Every nurse who'd stayed with Sarah during the tornado response was getting a complete automotive service. Oil change, brake inspection, tire rotation, fluid checks, and any necessary repairs. What about Sarah's Honda? Asked Danny Rodriguez from Rodriguez Auto Body. Tommy grinned. That one's special. Full restoration. New transmission, new brakes, complete detailing, the works. I want that car running like it just came off the lot. The mechanics had been planning in secret for 2 weeks. Tommy had driven by the hospital several times to scout the parking lot and identify which cars belonged to the nurses. He'd even gotten help from Pete, the security guard who'd been torn between his conscience and his orders during the tornado. The hard part is going to be timing, Tommy explained to the group. We need to get all the cars serviced simultaneously, and we need to do it as a surprise. That's when his phone rang. It was Sarah. Tommy, hi. I wanted to thank you again for supporting me at the hearing. Sarah, you don't need to thank me. How are things going with the lawsuit? Not great. The hospital is still demanding $150,000 in damages. My lawyer says they're probably going to win. Tommy's jaw tightened. Sarah, that's bullshit and you know it. Maybe, but it's expensive bullshit. I'm probably going to have to declare bankruptcy. After hanging up, Tommy turned to the other mechanics. Gentlemen, we're not just fixing cars anymore. We're making a statement. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical March weather in Illinois. Sarah was working the night shift at the hospital, where she'd been reassigned to the medical floor after her license was reinstated. The work was routine compared to trauma nursing, but at least she was working again. At 6 a.m., Tommy and his crew began arriving at the hospital parking lot. They'd coordinated with local police to block off a section of the lot, ostensibly for vehicle maintenance. 15 mechanics and 8 tow trucks and mobile service units pulled up to the cars belonging to Sarah, Maria, James, Tanya, and the other nurses who'd stayed during the tornado. Derek Morrison arrived for his early meeting and immediately called security. Pete, what the hell is going on in our parking lot? Pete looked out the window at the organized chaos of mechanics swarming over nurses' cars. Looks like community appreciation, sir. I want them removed immediately. They're trespassing. Sir, They have permits from the city for vehicle maintenance services. I checked with legal, and as long as they have the car owner's permission. Do they have permission? Pete consulted his clipboard. Tommy Sullivan has signed agreements from all the car owners authorizing emergency automotive services. Morrison's face turned red. Emergency automotive services? That's not a real thing. Actually, sir, it is. I looked it up. By 7 a.m., a crowd had gathered to watch the mechanics work. Word had spread on social media, and people were arriving with coffee and donuts for the workers. Local news vans pulled up, and reporters began interviewing community members about the impromptu car service event. Sarah was finishing her shift notes when Maria Rodriguez ran up to her, eyes wide with excitement. Sarah, you have to come outside right now. Maria, I'm exhausted. I just want to go home and sleep. Trust me, you need to see this. Sarah followed Maria to the elevator, wondering what could possibly require her immediate attention. When the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, she could hear music and laughter coming from outside. They walked through the lobby doors, and Sarah stopped dead in her tracks. Her 2015 Honda Civic, which had been showing its age with 180 miles and a concerning noise in the transmission, was up on a lift surrounded by mechanics. But it wasn't just her car. Every nurse who'd stayed during the tornado was getting their vehicle serviced by what looked like half the mechanics in Springfield. Tommy spotted her and jogged over, his coveralls already dirty despite the early hour. Surprise! He called out, grinning broadly. Tommy, what is this? This is the community saying thank you. You took care of us when we needed it most. Now we're taking care of you. Sarah looked around in amazement. James Chen's elderly Toyota was getting new brake pads. Maria's SUV was having its transmission serviced. Tanya Williams was standing next to her pickup truck, tears streaming down her face as a mechanic explained the free tire replacement she was receiving. Tommy, this is too much. I can't accept this. Yes, you can. And you will. Tommy's voice was firm but kind. Sarah, you saved dozens of lives and got sued for it. The least we can do is make sure your car doesn't break down on the way to court. A reporter from Channel 7 approached with a camera crew. Ms. Martinez, how does it feel to receive this support from the community? Sarah looked around at the mechanics working on cars, the volunteers serving coffee, the families who'd driven over just to show their appreciation. Many of these were people she'd treated during the tornado, but others were simply community members who'd heard about the situation and wanted to help. I'm overwhelmed, Sarah said honestly. I became a nurse to help people, and to see them helping me, it's more than I ever expected. What do you think this says about the community? It says that when institutions fail people, communities step up. These mechanics didn't have to do this. These volunteers didn't have to bring coffee and support, but they did it because they understand that we're all in this together. Inside the hospital, Derek Morrison was watching the scene from his office window. His assistant knocked on the door. Mr. Morrison, Channel 3 is here. They want a statement about the car service event. Morrison turned away from the window. Tell them no comment. Sir, this is getting a lot of positive coverage. Maybe we should... I said no comment, Morrison snapped. This is nothing but a publicity stunt designed to make the hospital look bad. His assistant hesitated. Sir, it's making the hospital look bad that we sued the nurses who saved lives. This community event is making us look worse by comparison. Morrison stared at his assistant. Are you questioning the hospital's legal strategy? No, sir. I'm just observing that the optics are challenging. By noon, the impromptu car service event had attracted hundreds of spectators. Local businesses had started bringing lunch for the mechanics. The mayor had showed up to present a key to the city to Sarah and her team. Social media was buzzing with photos and videos of the community coming together to support their local heroes. Tommy was putting the finishing touches on Sarah's Honda when she approached him. Tommy, I don't know how to thank you for this. You don't thank family, Sarah. And after what you did for Tyler, your family. He handed her the keys to her car. Full restoration. New transmission, new brakes, new tires, complete detailing. This car will run for another 200 miles. Sarah started crying as she looked at her completely restored Honda. It looked better than the day she'd bought it. There's one more thing, Tommy said, leading her around to the back of the car. On the rear window was a small decal that read, Community Cares, Sullivan's Auto. Every car we service today gets one, Tommy explained. So whenever you're driving around town, people will know that this community takes care of its heroes. As the mechanics began packing up their equipment, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed. The lawsuit was still pending. The medical board investigation was still ongoing. But the community had sent a clear message. They valued nurses who saved lives over administrators who protected profits. The story was just beginning to go viral. By Monday morning, the video of Sarah crying over her restored Honda had been viewed 2.3 million times on various social media platforms. The hashtags community appreciation and fix their rides were trending nationally, and news outlets from Chicago to Los Angeles were calling Tommy Sullivan's auto shop for interviews. Tommy arrived at his garage at 6 a.m. to find a line of news vans parked outside and reporters waiting with cameras and microphones. "Mr. Sullivan," called out a reporter from CNN, "can you comment on how the Springfield car service event has inspired similar actions in other cities?" Tommy looked confused as he unlocked his shop. "Other cities?" "Sir, mechanics in 12 cities have organized car service events for healthcare workers in their communities. The movement is spreading rapidly on social media." Tommy's phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, but he'd been too busy catching up on regular work to pay attention to the news coverage. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the messages. There were interview requests from Good Morning America, The Today Show, and dozens of local news stations across the country. "Mr. Sullivan," another reporter called out, "what was your goal in organizing the car service event?" Tommy thought about the question. "My goal was to say thank you to Sarah Martinez for saving my nephew's life. I didn't realize it would turn into all this." "Are you planning to organize more events?" "I'm planning to fix cars. That's what I do." But even as Tommy tried to downplay the attention, the movement was growing beyond his control. Mechanics in Detroit had organized a service event for nurses at Henry Ford Hospital. Auto shops in Phoenix were offering free oil changes to all healthcare workers. A group in Seattle had raised $50 to provide car repairs for nurses facing financial hardship. At Springfield General Hospital, Derek Morrison was dealing with a crisis that was spiraling beyond his ability to manage. The positive coverage of the community car service event was highlighting the hospital's lawsuit against the nurses by contrast, and the optics were devastating. Morrison's phone rang at 7 a.m. It was David Brennan, the CEO of Medicorp, the parent company that owned Springfield General. "Derek, we need to talk." "David, I know the coverage looks bad, but we can't back down on the lawsuit. If we don't enforce protocols..." "Derek, our stock price has dropped 8% since this story went national. Our other hospitals are reporting negative publicity spillover. The board is meeting an emergency session this afternoon." Morrison felt his stomach drop. "David, you can't let public relations concerns override legal strategy." "Derek, when public relations concerns threaten the company's financial stability, they become the legal strategy. We need this resolved immediately." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that by close of business today, this lawsuit against the nurses gets dropped, and this crisis gets resolved, or we'll find someone who can resolve it." Morrison hung up the phone and stared out his office window at the parking lot where, just 2 days earlier, mechanics had restored cars for the nurses he was suing. The irony wasn't lost on him that the community appreciation event had taken place on hospital property, making it impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Sarah was dealing with her own media attention. She'd received dozens of interview requests, book deal offers, and speaking engagement invitations. A talent agent from Los Angeles had called to discuss representation for a potential movie deal. "Sarah, this is incredible," Maria Rodriguez said as they sat in the hospital break room, scrolling through news coverage on their phones. "Look at this one from the Washington Post. Small-town mechanics inspire national movement to support healthcare workers." Sarah shook her head in amazement. "Maria, 3 days ago we were facing financial ruin from a lawsuit. Now we're getting movie offers. It's surreal." "Are you going to do any of the interviews?" "I don't know, this attention feels weird. I just want to be a nurse and take care of patients." That's when Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed Tommy Sullivan's auto shop. "Hey, Tommy, how are you handling all this media attention?" Tommy's voice sounded stressed. "Sarah, I need to ask you something. Are you okay with all this coverage? I never meant for your personal situation to become a national news story." "Tommy, what do you mean?" "I mean, reporters are digging into your lawsuit, your financial situation, your personal life. Some of them are asking questions about whether this was all planned as a publicity stunt." Sarah felt a chill. "A publicity stunt?" "Yeah. There are some people suggesting that you and I coordinated this whole thing to generate sympathy and pressure the hospital into dropping the lawsuit." "That's ridiculous. You organized the car service to say thank you. I didn't even know about it until it was happening." "I know that, and you know that, but some reporters are looking for a different angle. I just wanted to make sure you were prepared for questions." After hanging up with Tommy, Sarah realized that the viral success of their story was creating new complications. The more attention they received, the more scrutiny would follow. That afternoon, Derek Morrison's assistant knocked on his office door with an urgent message. "Mr. Morrison, legal needs to see you immediately. They say it's about the nurse lawsuit." Morrison walked to the legal department with a growing sense of dread. The hospital's head counsel, Margaret Chen, was waiting with a stack of documents. "Derek, we have a problem. The nurse lawsuit is becoming a public relations disaster that's affecting the entire Medicorp chain. Corporate is demanding that we settle immediately." "Settle? We can't settle. It sets a precedent that nurses can ignore protocols whenever they feel like it. Derek, the alternative is continued negative coverage that's costing the company millions in stock value and reputation damage. The board has made their decision." Margaret handed him a settlement agreement. "All legal action against the nurses is being dropped. Additionally, we're establishing a 100-0 community healthcare fund to support emergency response training." Morrison read the document in shock. "This is essentially an admission that we were wrong to sue them in the first place." "No, this is an admission that we can't win a public relations battle against mechanics fixing cars for local heroes." That evening, Sarah received a call from the hospital's legal department informing her that all lawsuits against the nurses had been dropped. The news should have been cause for celebration, but Sarah felt conflicted. "It doesn't feel like justice," she told Tommy when she called to share the news. "It feels like they backed down because of bad publicity, not because they realized they were wrong." "Sarah, does it matter why they backed down? The important thing is that you're not facing financial ruin anymore." "I suppose you're right, but Tommy, this whole experience has shown me something troubling about how healthcare works." "What do you mean?" "I mean that I had to break hospital policy to save lives, and when I was punished for it, the only thing that saved me was a viral video of mechanics fixing my car. That's not how a functional healthcare system should work." Tommy was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, maybe that's the point. Maybe the system needs to change, and stories like ours are how change happens." Sarah looked out her apartment window at the neighborhood she'd grown up in. 3 blocks away, she could see the lights of Tommy's auto shop, where he was probably working late as usual. "Tommy, do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't organized that car service event?" "You mean if I hadn't gotten involved?" "Yeah. If it had just been me fighting the lawsuit alone." Tommy's voice was firm. "Sarah, you wouldn't have been fighting alone. This community would have found some way to support you. Maybe not with car repairs, but with something. That's what communities do." "Is it, though? Or is it what communities do when there's a good story and media attention?" "Sarah, I organized that car service before there was any media attention. I did it because you saved my nephew's life, and that meant something to me. The media attention was unexpected." Sarah nodded, even though Tommy couldn't see her. "You're right. I'm sorry for questioning your motives. You don't need to apologize for asking hard questions. That's what nurses do, you ask the hard questions that other people don't want to ask." As Sarah prepared for bed, she realized that while the lawsuit was over, the larger questions it had raised were just beginning. The viral success of their story had created a platform, and now people were looking to her for answers about healthcare, community, and what happens when institutions fail the people they're supposed to serve. The attention was about to go national. Sarah Martinez had never expected to be sitting in the green room at NBC Studios in Chicago, waiting to appear on the Today Show. But there she was, at 6:30 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, wearing her best suit and trying not to throw up from nerves. The producer, an energetic woman named Jennifer, sat down beside her. "Sarah, we're going to focus on the community response to your situation. The car service story has really resonated with viewers, so we want to emphasize that angle." "What about the healthcare policy issues?" Sarah asked. "The problems with how hospitals handle emergency situations?" Jennifer's smile became slightly strained. "Well, those are important topics, but they're a bit complex for morning television. The community support story is more uplifting and accessible." Sarah nodded, but she felt frustrated. The car service event had been wonderful, but it was a symptom of a much larger problem. The fact that community fundraising had been necessary to fight a lawsuit for saving lives suggested something fundamentally broken about the healthcare system. Across the country, Tommy Sullivan was dealing with his own media requests from his auto shop in Springfield. A crew from CNN had driven down from Chicago to interview him about the movement he'd inadvertently started. "Mr. Sullivan," the reporter asked, "mechanics in 23 cities have now organized car service events for healthcare workers. Did you anticipate this kind of response?" Tommy wiped his hands on a shop rag before answering. "No, I didn't anticipate anything. I just wanted to say thank you to a nurse who saved my nephew's life." But now you've become a symbol of community action and grassroots support for healthcare workers. How does that feel? It feels like people are making this more complicated than it needs to be. Sarah Martinez saved lives. The community wanted to help her. That's not complicated, the reporter pressed on. But critics are saying that relying on community fundraising and volunteer services is a band-aid solution that lets healthcare institutions off the hook for systemic problems. Tommy paused his work and looked directly at the camera. Look, I'm a mechanic. I fix cars. I don't know anything about systemic problems or healthcare policy. But I know that when good people are punished for doing good work, other good people should help them. That's not complicated either. Back in Chicago, Sarah was being led to the studio for her interview. The host, Craig Melvin, greeted her warmly before they went on air. Sarah, just be yourself, he advised. Tell the story naturally. America loves stories about community coming together. The interview began with a recap of the tornado response and the subsequent lawsuit. Craig asked about her decision to stay and treat patients despite evacuation orders. Craig, I've been a nurse for 12 years, Sarah explained. I took an oath to preserve life and relieve suffering. When I saw those ambulances arriving with critically injured patients, I couldn't just walk away because of paperwork and protocols. And the hospital sued you for that decision? Yes. They sued me and 5 other nurses for $150,000 each, claiming we violated protocols and created liability issues. Craig shook his head sympathetically. That must have been incredibly stressful. It was devastating. We saved dozens of lives and were facing financial ruin because of it. But then the community stepped up in a remarkable way. Tell us about Tommy Sullivan and what the mechanics did. Sarah smiled as she described the surprise car service event. Tommy organized 12 mechanics to service all of our cars as a way of saying thank you. They completely restored my Honda Civic, which was on its last legs. But more than that, it was a statement that the community valued what we'd done. And that story has inspired similar events across the country. Yes, and I'm amazed by that. But Craig, I want to make sure people understand that the car service was wonderful, but it was necessary because of a broken system. Healthcare workers shouldn't need community fundraising to survive lawsuits for saving lives. Craig's expression became slightly uncomfortable. Of course, healthcare policy is complex. It's not that complex, actually. Hospitals prioritized legal liability over patient care. When nurses chose patient care over legal protection, we were punished. That's a system that needs to change. The interview continued for another few minutes, with Craig steering the conversation back to the feel-good community support angle. But Sarah had managed to plant the seed of the larger issue. After the show, Sarah checked her phone and found dozens of messages. Many were congratulatory, but others were more interesting. A healthcare policy researcher from Johns Hopkins wanted to interview her about emergency response protocols. A journalist from ProPublica was investigating similar cases of healthcare workers being punished for patient advocacy. A documentary filmmaker wanted to explore the tension between corporate healthcare and patient care. Tommy was experiencing his own unexpected attention. His auto shop had received calls from mechanics across the country wanting advice on organizing service events for healthcare workers. A part supplier had offered to donate materials for future community service projects. Most surprisingly, he'd received a call from the United Auto Workers Union asking if he wanted to help organize a national Mechanics for Healthcare campaign. I don't know about all that, Tommy told his wife Linda over dinner. I just wanted to help Sarah and the other nurses. Now people want me to be some kind of spokesperson for a movement. Linda looked at her husband with affection. Tommy, whether you want it or not, you've started something important. Maybe you should think about where it goes from here. Meanwhile, at Springfield General Hospital, Derek Morrison was dealing with the aftermath of the national attention. The hospital's board of directors had called an emergency meeting to discuss the ongoing public relations crisis. Board chairman Robert Hayes read from a prepared statement. The board has decided that a change in leadership is necessary to restore community trust and improve the hospital's relationship with staff and patients. Morrison felt his world collapsing. Robert, I followed proper protocols throughout this situation. The nurses violated clear evacuation orders. Derek, the nurses saved lives while following proper protocols would have let people die. The community understands that, even if you don't. You're firing me because of bad publicity? We're replacing you because your decision-making prioritized corporate liability over patient care and community service. That's not aligned with this hospital's mission. Morrison cleared out his office that afternoon, watching from his window as reporters interviewed staff members about the hospital's response to the tornado crisis. Every interview seemed to emphasize the disconnect between administrative policies and frontline healthcare work. As evening approached, Sarah drove home from Chicago in her restored Honda Civic. The Community Cares decal on her rear window had attracted friendly honks and waves from other drivers throughout her trip. She realized that Tommy's simple act of gratitude had created something much larger than either of them had anticipated. Her phone rang as she pulled into her driveway. It was a call from Washington, D.C. Ms. Martinez, this is Congressman Michael Torres's office. The Congressman chairs the House Subcommittee on Health. He'd like to invite you to testify at a hearing on emergency healthcare protocols and healthcare worker protection. Sarah sat in her car, engine still running, trying to process what she'd just heard. You want me to testify before Congress? Yes, ma'am. The Congressman believes your experience highlights important issues in healthcare policy that deserve national attention. After hanging up, Sarah called Tommy. Tommy, they want me to testify before Congress. About what? About healthcare policy? About what happened to us? Tommy was quiet for a moment. Sarah, do you want to do that? I think I have to. If there's a chance to prevent other healthcare workers from going through what we went through, I have to try. Then do it. And Sarah? Yeah? Remember that you're not just speaking for yourself. You're speaking for everyone who's ever had to choose between following rules and saving lives. Sarah looked at her reflection in the car's rearview mirror. A month ago, she'd been a small-town nurse facing financial ruin for doing her job. Now, she was being asked to represent healthcare workers before Congress. The transformation was about to be complete. 6 weeks after the tornado, Sarah Martinez stood in the Rayburn House office building in Washington, D.C., preparing to testify before the House Subcommittee on Health. The hearing room was packed with reporters, healthcare advocates, and policy experts, all there to discuss emergency healthcare protocols and healthcare worker protection. Congressman Michael Torres, the subcommittee chairman, opened the hearing with a statement that referenced Sarah's case directly. We're here today because a tornado in Illinois exposed fundamental flaws in how our healthcare system responds to emergencies. When nurses were sued for saving lives, and when community mechanics had to organize car repairs to support them, we know something is broken. Sarah was the lead witness, seated at a table with microphones and water glasses, facing a panel of congressional representatives. To her right sat Dr. Robert Chen, an emergency medicine physician who'd studied the Springfield response. To her left was Tommy Sullivan, who'd been invited to represent the community perspective. Tommy looked uncomfortable in his borrowed suit, but he'd insisted on coming to support Sarah. Miss Martinez, Congressman Torres began, please tell the committee about the decisions you made during the tornado emergency and their consequences. Sarah had practiced this testimony dozens of times, but sitting in the formal hearing room, she felt the weight of representing every healthcare worker who'd ever faced similar impossible choices. Congressman Torres, on March 15th, I was faced with a choice between following hospital evacuation protocols and providing emergency care to critically injured tornado victims. I chose patient care. In 8 hours, my team treated 127 patients with 0 fatalities and 0 major complications. For this, I was suspended, sued for 150, 0, and nearly lost my nursing license. Representative Jennifer Walsh from Illinois leaned forward. Ms. Martinez, hospital administrators argue that protocols exist for good reasons. How do you respond to concerns that allowing healthcare workers to deviate from established procedures could create chaos? Representative Walsh, protocols should serve patient care, not replace it. When protocols prevent healthcare workers from saving lives, those protocols are failing their fundamental purpose. Representative Mark Stevens from Texas, clearly skeptical, jumped in. Martinez, you're asking us to believe that your unauthorized operation in a parking lot provided better care than patients would have received through proper channels? Representative Stevens, I'm not asking you to believe anything. The medical records speak for themselves. Perfect patient outcomes under impossible conditions, achieved by experienced healthcare professionals doing what they were trained to do. Dr. Chen, the emergency medicine expert, supported Sarah's testimony with data. Congressman, our analysis of the Springfield response shows that traditional evacuation protocols would have resulted in an estimated 15 preventable deaths due to transport delays and overwhelmed receiving facilities. The improvised triage operation prevented those deaths. Representative Stevens wasn't convinced. Dr. Chen, that's speculation. We can't know what would have happened under different circumstances. Actually, Representative, we can. We have detailed medical records of patient conditions upon arrival at the triage site. transport times to alternative facilities, and survival probability calculations. The data is clear. Tommy was called to testify about the community response, and his plain-spoken testimony provided a powerful contrast to the policy discussions. Congressman, I'm not a healthcare expert or a policy guy. I fix cars, but I know right from wrong. Sarah Martinez saved my nephew's life, and then she was punished for it. That's wrong. The community stepped up because the system failed. Representative Walsh asked Tommy about the broader implications of community-based support for healthcare workers. Mr. Sullivan, while the community response to Miss Martinez's situation was heartwarming, shouldn't we focus on fixing the system rather than relying on voluntary community action? Tommy nodded. Ma'am, you're absolutely right. Communities shouldn't have to organize car repair events because healthcare workers are getting sued for saving lives. But until you fix the system, communities will keep stepping up. That's what good people do. The most dramatic moment of the hearing came when Representative Stevens questioned the precedent of supporting healthcare workers who violated protocols. Mr. Sullivan, if we excuse protocol violations when the outcomes are good, how do we maintain accountability in healthcare? Tommy looked at Representative Stevens with the directness of someone unaccustomed to political speech. Representative, accountability means being responsible for the consequences of your actions. Sarah Martinez took responsibility for saving lives. The hospital administrator took responsibility for protecting profits. The community decided which kind of accountability we wanted to support. The hearing room fell silent. Tommy's simple statement had cut through hours of policy discussions to the heart of the issue. After the testimony, Sarah found herself surrounded by reporters and policy advocates. A healthcare reform organization wanted her to join their board. A nursing association asked her to speak at their national conference. A publisher offered her a book deal. But the conversation that mattered most happened in a quiet corner of the Capitol building cafeteria, where Sarah sat with Tommy and Congressman Torres. Sarah, the congressman said, your testimony was powerful, but I need to ask you directly, what specific changes do you want to see? Sarah had thought about this question extensively. Congressman, I want legal protections for healthcare workers who prioritize patient care over administrative protocols during emergencies. I want emergency response policies that put patient outcomes first. And I want accountability measures that judge healthcare decisions based on patient welfare rather than liability concerns. Those are significant policy changes that would affect hospitals nationwide. Good, because this problem isn't unique to Springfield General. Healthcare workers across the country face similar pressure to prioritize institutional protection over patient care. Tommy added his perspective. Congressman, fixing this shouldn't be complicated. Make it so healthcare workers can't get sued for saving lives. Make it so communities don't have to organize car repair events to support their local heroes. 6 months later, the Sarah Martinez Act was signed into law, providing federal protection for healthcare workers who prioritize patient care during declared emergencies. The law also established funding for community emergency preparedness training and required hospitals to justify any disciplinary action taken against staff during crisis responses. Sarah had returned to Springfield General, where she was now Director of Emergency Preparedness. The hospital had implemented new protocols that prioritized patient care over liability concerns, and community input was required for all emergency planning decisions. Tommy's Auto Shop had expanded to include a community service division that provided free vehicle maintenance for essential workers throughout the region. The Mechanics for Healthcare program had spread to over 200 cities nationwide. Derek Morrison had moved to Florida, where he worked as a consultant helping hospitals manage public relations crises. He never publicly commented on the Springfield events. On the first anniversary of the tornado, Sarah stood in the same parking lot where she'd organized triage during the storm. The area had been converted into a permanent emergency response staging area, equipped with power, water, and medical supplies. A plaque commemorated the healthcare workers who'd stayed to treat patients despite evacuation orders. Tommy joined her, along with Tyler Johnson, now a healthy 9-year-old who'd brought flowers to honor the superheroes who'd saved his life. Sarah, Tommy said, do you ever think about how different things would have been if you'd followed the evacuation order? Sarah looked at Tyler, who was carefully placing flowers by the memorial plaque. I think about it every day. But Tommy, I've learned something important. Sometimes the most important choice isn't between right and wrong. It's between doing what you're told and doing what you know is right. And you'd make the same choice again? Sarah smiled. In a heartbeat, the notification popped up on Sarah Martinez's phone as she was preparing for the evening shift at Springfield General. Today marks 1 year since your tornado triage story went viral. Your story has been shared 47 million times and inspired community support programs in 312 cities nationwide. Sarah put her phone away without reading the rest. The viral metrics felt surreal compared to the simple reality of her daily work as Director of Emergency Preparedness. Today, like most days, was about training sessions, protocol reviews, and ensuring that Springfield General was ready for whatever crisis might come next. The hospital had changed dramatically in the past year. The new CEO, Dr. Racin, Maria Santos, no relation to the Santos who delivered her babies in the parking lot, had implemented patient-first policies throughout the organization. The board of directors now included 2 registered nurses and 3 community representatives. Most importantly, the hospital's emergency protocols explicitly prioritized patient care over liability concerns. "Sarah," called James Chen, who'd been promoted to Assistant Director of Emergency Services, "the training session with the new residents is starting in 15 minutes. Every month, Sarah conducted training sessions for new medical staff on emergency response. The curriculum included case studies from the tornado response, but Sarah always emphasized that the parking lot triage had been necessitated by system failures, not heroic choices. The training room filled with first-year residents, nurses, and EMT students. Sarah began with her standard opening. "A year ago, I was sued for 150, zero for saving lives during a tornado. Today, we're going to talk about why that happened and how we prevent it from happening again." Dr. Jennifer Park, a first-year emergency medicine resident, raised her hand. "Ms. Martinez, I've read about your case, but wasn't the real issue that you violated protocols? How do we balance following procedures with clinical judgment?" It was a question Sarah heard frequently, and she developed a careful response. "Dr. Park, protocols exist to guide decision-making, not replace it. When protocols serve patient welfare, they're valuable tools. When protocols prevent you from saving lives, they become obstacles. The key is developing the clinical judgment to know the difference." After the training session, Sarah drove to Tommy Sullivan's expanded auto shop. The original garage had grown into Sullivan's Community Service Center, which provided free vehicle maintenance for healthcare workers, teachers, and first responders throughout central Illinois. Tommy was under the hood of a police cruiser when Sarah arrived. "Hey Sarah, how'd the training go?" "Good. The residents are asking smart questions about clinical decision-making versus protocol compliance." Tommy emerged from under the hood, wiping his hands on a familiar shop rag. "Any of them seem like they'd have stayed during the tornado?" Sarah considered the question. "A few, maybe. But Tommy, I hope they never have to find out. The point of all this training is to create systems that don't put healthcare workers in impossible situations." They walked to Tommy's office, which was covered with photos and thank you letters from healthcare workers who'd received free car services. A map on the wall showed the locations of 200-plus mechanics for healthcare programs across the country. "Tommy, do you ever get tired of being known as the mechanic who started a movement?" Tommy laughed. "Sarah, do you ever get tired of being known as the nurse who organized parking lot triage?" "Every day. But you keep doing the speaking engagements and the interviews?" Sarah nodded. "Because if I don't tell our story, someone else will tell their version of it. And their version usually focuses on the drama instead of the systemic problems we identified." A knock on the office door interrupted them. Pete, the former hospital security guard who now worked for Tommy's community service program, peeked in. "Sarah, there's someone here to see you. Says it's about a tornado response training program." The visitor was Dr. Rachel Martinez, no relation, a emergency preparedness specialist from FEMA who'd driven down from Chicago specifically to meet with Sarah. "Ms. Martinez, I've been following your work since the tornado response. FEMA is developing new guidelines for hospital emergency preparedness, and we'd like your input on community integration protocols." Sarah was intrigued. "What kind of input?" "We want to formalize the lesson from Springfield, that effective emergency response requires coordination between hospitals, community organizations, and local businesses. Your parking lot triage worked because the community mobilized to support it." Dr. Martinez outlined FEMA's new approach. Emergency preparedness plans that included community mechanics, restaurants, volunteer organizations, and local businesses as integral parts of the response system. The traditional model isolated hospitals during emergencies, Dr. Martinez explained. Your case proved that community integration actually improves patient outcomes and system resilience. After Dr. Martinez left, Sarah and Tommy walked to the hospital parking lot where the tornado triage had taken place. The area was now equipped with permanent emergency response infrastructure, power connections, water access, and storage facilities for medical supplies. Sarah, Tommy said, do you think we actually changed anything? Or did we just create a feel-good story that made people feel better about broken systems? It was a question Sarah had wrestled with for months. Tommy, I think we changed some things and exposed others that still need changing. The legal protections for healthcare workers are real, the community emergency preparedness funding is real, but the fundamental tension between corporate healthcare and patient care? That's still there. So what do we do about it? We keep telling the story. We keep training people to prioritize patients over policies. We keep building communities that support healthcare workers instead of suing them. That evening, Sarah received a call that brought the past year full circle. It was Mrs. Patterson, her diabetic neighbor whose blood sugar she'd stabilized during the tornado response. Sarah, I just wanted to let you know that my granddaughter Emma is starting nursing school next fall. She says she wants to be like the nurse who stayed during the tornado. After hanging up, Sarah sat in her living room, looking at the various awards and recognitions she'd received over the past year. The Key to the City, the State Nursing Excellence Award, the Congressional Recognition for Healthcare Advocacy. But Mrs. Patterson's call meant more than all of them combined. The real measure of success wasn't the viral video or the national attention. It was that a young woman had chosen nursing because she'd heard a story about nurses who prioritized patients over policies. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Tyler Johnson, Tommy's nephew, now 10 years old. Aunt Sarah, I got an A on my report about community heroes. Thank you for saving my life and showing me what heroes look like. As she prepared for bed, Sarah realized that the story that began with tornado sirens and ended with mechanics fixing cars had become something larger. A reminder that ordinary people could make extraordinary choices and that communities could support those choices even when institutions failed. The legacy wasn't the viral fame or the policy changes, though both mattered. The legacy was that when the next crisis came, more healthcare workers would know they had the support of their communities, and more communities would know how to provide that support. Tomorrow would bring another day of training sessions, policy meetings, and emergency preparedness planning. But tonight, Sarah Martinez went to sleep, knowing that she'd helped create a world where saving lives was less likely to result in lawsuits and more likely to result in community appreciation. 5 years after the tornado, Sarah Martinez stood before an audience of 20 healthcare workers at the American Nurses Association National Conference. Her keynote address was titled, When Systems Fail, Community Resilience in Healthcare Crisis. The speech had evolved over dozens of similar presentations, but the core message remained constant. Healthcare workers shouldn't have to choose between following protocols and saving lives, and communities shouldn't have to organize fundraisers to support healthcare workers who make the right choice. The Springfield tornado response wasn't remarkable because we saved lives, Sarah told the audience. It was remarkable because we were punished for it, and because our community had to step up to protect us from our own institution. In the audience, she spotted familiar faces. Maria Rodriguez, now a nurse practitioner specializing in disaster medicine. James Chen, who'd completed medical school and was working as an emergency physician. And Tanya Williams, who'd become a nursing educator focusing on clinical decision-making under pressure. After the speech, Sarah was approached by Dr. Amanda Foster, a healthcare policy researcher from Harvard. Sarah, I've been studying the ripple effects of the Springfield case. The Sarah Martinez Act has been invoked 847 times in the past 5 years to protect healthcare workers who prioritized patient care over administrative policies. But more importantly, the community support model has been replicated in thousands of communities nationwide. The data was impressive. Over 500 mechanics for healthcare programs providing free vehicle services to essential workers, community emergency preparedness programs in 200+ cities, and a documented shift in how hospitals approached emergency planning. But Sarah had learned to be skeptical of purely positive metrics. Dr. Foster, what about the cases that didn't go viral? What about healthcare workers who don't have communities willing to organize car repair fundraisers? Dr. Foster nodded. That's the limitation of relying on community support for systemic problems. Viral moments create change for the lucky few, but structural problems require structural solutions. It was a fair criticism. Sarah's story had a happy ending because she lived in a community that valued healthcare workers and had a mechanic willing to organize support. But what about rural hospitals with no community support? What about healthcare workers whose advocacy didn't generate sympathetic media coverage? Later that evening, Sarah sat in her hotel room video calling Tommy Sullivan, who was now running a nonprofit organization that helped communities develop support systems for essential workers. Tommy, I sometimes wonder if we've created a model that only works for people with good stories and supportive communities. Tommy, now recognized as a national leader in community organizing, had thought about this question extensively. Sarah, I think you're asking the wrong question. The question isn't whether our model works for everyone. The question is whether it's better to have imperfect community support than no support at all. But shouldn't we be focusing on fixing the systems that create these problems in the first place? We should be doing both. Community support for the immediate crises, system change for the long-term solutions. They're not mutually exclusive. The next morning, Sarah received a call that brought her full circle. It was Tyler Johnson, now 15 years old, and interested in emergency medicine. Sarah, I'm applying for a summer internship at Springfield General. I want to work in the emergency department where you guys saved me. Tyler, that's wonderful. But why emergency medicine? Because I learned something from watching you and Uncle Tommy. Sometimes the most important work happens when systems break down and people have to step up. I want to be the kind of person who steps up. After the call, Sarah realized that perhaps the most important legacy of their story wasn't the policy changes or the community programs. It was that a generation of young people had learned that ordinary citizens could challenge broken systems and win. The tornado response had started with an impossible choice: follow orders or save lives. It had evolved into a viral story about community support triumphing over institutional failure. But ultimately, it had become something more fundamental. Proof that when institutions fail people, people don't have to fail each other. Sarah's phone displayed a news notification. Hospital workers strike for patient safety protections, citing Springfield model of community support. In 3 different cities, healthcare workers were using community organizing techniques inspired by Tommy's mechanic network to advocate for patient-centered policies. The ripple effects continued expanding. The specific story of tornado triage and car repairs had become a template for community action in defense of public service values. Teachers facing budget cuts, firefighters dealing with equipment shortages, and social workers navigating bureaucratic obstacles were all finding ways to build community support for their essential work. As Sarah packed for her flight home to Springfield, she reflected on the question that had driven her since the tornado. What happens when doing the right thing puts you in conflict with official policies? The answer, she'd learned, was that communities could bridge the gap between institutional failure and human need. Not perfectly, not permanently, but effectively enough to save lives and create space for systemic change. The tornado had lasted 20 minutes. The parking lot triage had lasted 8 hours. The lawsuit had lasted 6 months. But the community that had formed around those events had created lasting change that was still expanding 5 years later. Sarah Martinez returned to Springfield, where she continued her work training healthcare workers to prioritize patients over policies, knowing that if they made that choice, their community would support them. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was a human one. And sometimes, human systems were strong enough to fix broken institutional ones, one car repair at a time.